That was terrific, especially because my name is Felicia Wong, by the way, but I have the great privilege of being the president of the Roosevelt Institute. So there's nothing like seeing President Roosevelt to introduce the conversation that we have today about politics and a path forward for cash and basic income. I am really pleased to be joined by Chris and Bill and Joe. And what we're going to do today is to have about a 40-minute conversation about really where this issue is in today's politics. One of the most notable things about, I've been sort of part of the basic income or cash conversation for about 4 or 5 years. And it has moved remarkably, right, from sort of West Coast tech entrepreneurs, a sort of niche-y sort of conversation, to something that has been taken up now by many of our most mainstream politicians. It's very notable that Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton feel compelled to talk about cash, talk about basic income, and really address it as a major potential solution. So I think we've seen a lot of movement in this conversation today, and we're going to explore how that has worked both at the state and the national level with Chris and Bill and Joe. So my job is to moderate, and I'm going to open up with a pretty big question. This is for each of you, and you can take it in whatever order you like. But I'd like to know how each of you first heard of the idea of a basic income or a base income or sort of cash for all. And then when you started talking about it to your friends, to your colleagues, to your constituents, what in the world did they make of this idea that you were bringing to them? Actually, why don't we go ahead and start with you, Bill, since in many ways Alaska, which you represent, has been a pioneer in this.
Yeah, so we have a permanent fund in Alaska, and this was set up in 1976 by a constitutional amendment. The people voted for it overwhelmingly, and that created a permanent fund. We've got, just stepping back, in the early 70s, we struck oil, Prudhoe Bay, one of the largest oil fields in North America, and we got a $900 million bonus from the oil industry, and this was at a time when we had budgets of around $125 million. They spent it all within about 4 years. And so the people were very upset about that. Some of it went to good things, but the people were upset about that, and they said, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? How do we save for the future? And so they passed a constitutional amendment in 1976, and then 1982, we created the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend Program. And so we pay a dividend to all Alaskans just for living there. And you have to live there for 1 full calendar year. And this year, the dividend was scheduled to be $2,645 per person. It was cut down by the legislature. But we've been
a family of 4, $10,000 a year for being an Alaskan.
Yep. In fact, when Sarah Palin was governor in 2008, she increased the amount. We had huge oil surpluses, and the amount that was paid out to every man, woman, and child was $3,249, and an enormous amount. And her popularity went up to 90%. So we've had it for 35 years. So what are you guys waiting for?
So in other words, Bill, what you're saying is that in Alaska, the question isn't so much like, how in the world could you be bringing this crazy idea to us, but it's much more, how could you dare consider taking what we already have away from us? That's really the...
Absolutely. This has become ingrained in the Alaska culture. We have a permanent fund dividend. You get, but here's the important thing, and I think this is a matter of framing, right? They have right to work. Right to work is not a right to work, it's right to work for less, but it's all about framing. And so, and I think this is really important politically to go forward on this. We don't talk about this in terms of a basic income in Alaska. In fact, if you told Alaskans that, hey, you get a basic income, this is an entitlement, they will fight you. This is not something that they look at. They look at it, and actually we all look at it. This is our share of the oil wealth. This is how we've got this tremendous resource. This is how we share it, not just with this generation, but with future generations. And so it's a very important distinction. We all own the oil. We all own the resource. How do we share that best with the people? You know, the way government works traditionally, you have, we collect money in the form of taxes, royalties, whatever. And then those who have political power, those who have a lot of money, hire lobbyists, and they come in, or they go and they lobby government, and they get a huge chunk back. And so back in 1982, if you look at the history, what happened was the legislators and the governor recognized this. They said, we've got all these programs, but the money is not getting out to the average Alaskans. We're collecting all this oil wealth. How do we share it? How do we make sure it gets back to Alaskans? And they decided, well, let's do it through a dividend. Every man, woman, and child gets the same amount. You don't have to hire a lobbyist to go do it. And so the struggle that we're facing now is we've got all the special interests who are lining up on both political spectrums and trying to get their bigger share of a dividend than what we have.
So, Bill, I'm actually going to stop you because let's tell the difficult part of the political story in just a second. But I want to turn to Chris now to ask, this is an idea that you and your colleagues across the political spectrum are really bringing to Hawaii. So tell us where you are in this conversation.
Well, apparently living in the wrong state. I think moving to Alaska is probably the next.
What you need is oil revenue, right?
But
a little colder.
But I think for us, this really comes out of a slightly different context, but one which I think a lot of people nationally can identify with. I think for a long time in Hawaii and certainly throughout the country, we've based our success on metrics with like GDP, for example, which I think for the average American doesn't really mean much at all. When you look at job numbers in Hawaii, we are among the states with the absolute lowest unemployment, which is a great thing. But what's missing in the data, and I think what the average person will tell you, is that the jobs they have access to are often part-time, without the adequate benefits that any full-time position would provide, or they're working multiple jobs, or they're working a full-time job that just isn't enough to make it in a place where the cost of living is rising steadily, and you have this disconnect between the measures by which government, I think, often looks to track progress.
To economic health.
Right,
Yeah,
but for the average person, it just doesn't manifest itself. So I think for us, this has been a long time coming. And it's not that we're driving toward, I think, one policy solution. I think what's happened in Hawaii, and the reason we've seen a little bit of progress and the opening of a discussion, is that what we're here to talk about is not a mechanism. We're not here to talk about basic income. We're not here to talk about an EITC or what have you. We're here to talk about fundamentally the values that underlie that. And I think that's true here today. We're not here to advocate for a policy. We want the results of that policy in our society today. And I think for us, starting with that value
and what's
mindset,
the result specifically? It's economic security. Is that how you're framing
it is.
in
It is.
your
I think,
conversations?
For our long history of really strong cultural connection and community connection in Hawaii, we've come forward to say all families deserve basic financial security. That is something that I think every American hopes for and would love to see in this country. And no one who works a full-time job should ever have to suffer through poverty and be unable to feed their kids. That's something that is pretty fundamental. But that North Star that I think we aspirationally reach out to in the long term is driving the discussion today about, all right, what are the mechanisms, what are the new ways to evaluate community and family health to drive the policy forward?
Right. Well, I'm going to come back to both of you to ask sort of how it starts to play out in real life politics and whether really don't people ever get kind of sharp elbowed about any of this. But before we do that, I want to ask Joe. Joe, you are you're from California, or you're working in California now, which is a very different state than either Hawaii or Alaska. But you are working on a set of measures also to try to increase people's economic security. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. The biggest problem that Californians face is most people who are working can't afford life's basic needs. This isn't a problem that's faced just by those who are poorest. This is literally a problem that's faced by 3 out of 4 Californians. 3 out of 4 Californians couldn't weather a $700 surprise expense. That's the real life of most Californians who are a small health problem, a couple of blown tires, a busted pipe in their apartment away from financial crisis. 1 of 8 Americans live in California. So when 3 out of 4 Californians have no semblance of financial security, this is an American crisis. Even worse, 1 out of 5 Californians live in deep poverty. Another 1 out of 5 Californians live near poverty. And the essential breakdown is work no longer pays enough to enable someone to afford life's basic needs. And the future that we have to create is one where everyone who works can afford life's basic needs. This is the problem that most Californians stress about when you talk with people outside of Beverly Hills and Pacific Heights. And it's why we've put so much energy and passion behind California's earned income tax credit, which is, as many of you know, a cashback tax credit for low-income workers to literally make their work pay better. We launched an earned income tax credit in California that went into effect in 2016. Then it continued in 2017, and we massively expanded it so that next year, 3 times more Californians will be able to claim the earned income tax credit. The way that we won this massive policy expansion, though, is different than the customary playbook out there in the progressive movement, which has come too much to rely on influencers talking with politicians. Instead, this spring, we activated over 70,000 low-income California families to contact their legislators and demand massive EITC expansion, and we won big. Next year, 1.7 million California families will be able to earn the earned income tax credit, up from 600,000 the past 2 years. Your original question was about how people respond when you talk with them about this subject matter. Frankly, when you talk with people in Pacific Heights and Beverly Hills about it, there's no sense of awareness, because the California of Pacific Heights and Beverly Hills is not the California that almost everyone experiences. But if you talk to almost every other Californian, the 2 things they tell you most commonly are, I'm working really hard and I'm not making enough, and my work isn't providing me the ability to afford my basic needs. And so the problem is really simple. Too many people are working, and in fact, most people who are working can't afford life's basic needs. And the mission is really clear. Everyone who works should be able to afford life's basic needs. And whether you think we advance that future through EITC or universal basic income, I think it ought to be the North Star that guides us. It's the social contract that I think threads through many generations of Americans, and it's absolutely broken down for 3 out of 4 Californians. It's, I think, why EITC animates a lot of Californians. People often tell me when I'm in Pacific Heights and Beverly Hills that, oh, the EITC, it's so boring. It sounds so boring. But to the 3 out of 4 Californians who are a $700 surprise expense away from financial crisis, it's what they need to provide a 3rd meal a day for their kids and to pay their utility bills. And I think it's why so many low-income voters have become active in the political process as their own lobbyists to drive this massive EITC expansion. I think it's a blueprint for how we can drive a lot of economic security work in the future. We need to move it beyond just influencers advocating to our politicians. We have to make low-income people themselves their best champions.
Great, thank you. So I want to now come back to this question of, the perhaps somewhat conflictual side of politics. And Bill, you started to tell us a story about you've got a permanent fund, you've got a dividend. It's existed since the early 1980s. But in some ways, it's a rich political target for special interests on the right and the left. So both tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us how you deal with that in order to protect the economic security goals that the fund really tries to advance.
So our permanent fund has now grown to about $65 billion. And it's the largest savings account in the United States. It pales in comparison to Norway, for example, which with virtually the same amount of oil created I think it's a sovereign wealth fund of nearly $1 trillion. But at $65 billion, we are earning about 7% per year. That's the projected for the next 10 years. We earn a lot more than that this year, but that spins off around $4.5 billion per year. Our total cost of government is $4 billion. The problem that we have in Alaska is we are on the verge of being completely broke. We have no income tax, we have no sales tax, we have no state property taxes, we have no state overall taxes at all. We rely pretty much solely on oil. And for years, we've gotten a huge amount from oil. Unfortunately, After Sarah Palin came in and jacked up our oil taxes significantly, to the surprise of many people, her predecessor, who was a lobbyist for an oil company, came in and lowered them way down. And so now we are actually paying out more in oil tax credits than we get in oil taxes. So, but how does the permanent fund play into this? Because the solution for many people, our state government is a resource extraction, we're a resource extraction state. We have many people who work in the resource extraction industries in government. They want to use the permanent fund to pay for government. They don't want to increase taxes on oil. They don't want to increase taxes on businesses. They don't want to have, and so we have this friction that's being created because how are we going to pay for government? That's the battle that's playing out right now. So for the last 2 years, we've had cuts to our dividend. We've got two statutes. One statute talks about how we may pay out oil tax credits, and another statute says we shall pay a full dividend. Guess which one was fully funded the last 2 years? The oil tax credits, right? They have more political power. The permanent fund was cut more than 50%. And so we've got this political battle. And so what I've been pushing for, and others are starting to gain steam, is let's put it in the Constitution. Let's put the dividend in the Constitution of Alaska. That way the politicians can't muck around with it. But yeah, it's definitely a political battle that we're facing.
So put the dividend in the Constitution, fight hard for raising taxes. Sorry, those are my own politics showing. I'm not going to give you a hard time about that. Chris, so you're at a much earlier stage of this political conversation in Hawaii. Why don't you tell us about the varied political actors that you've brought together in a task force, a working group, to try to really solve the problems that you've identified fundamentally as problems of economic growth, economic health, and economic security?
Yeah, as we sort of tackle these issues, we've really wanted to take what is a politically realistic approach and actually do something rather than just give lip service to wanting to do good and then not being able to follow through. So as we, this past year, passed a couple of things forward, one being a state EITC, which we've never had before. And I give a lot of credit to our colleagues who really championed this and have been championing it for a long time. We also expanded the definition of work to look beyond just what is a normal paycheck, but rather what kind of work is going on in our economy that people are pouring their hours and themselves into that often go overlooked, like
so caregiving.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the third thing we're doing is sort of taking a look at the long term. So we passed unanimously, to my surprise, a piece of legislation which creates a task force, but does so to achieve this goal, which I mentioned before, to start the conversation around how to provide basic financial security to everyone. And for us, that meant bringing together these stakeholders, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, labor, business, and so on. And so we're getting started in this conversation with a lot of good voices at the table. And I think it's a rare moment, perhaps in this political atmosphere in this country today, to see that sort of thing happen. But I think people recognize that our economy is changing, whether it's automation, disruption, changing the landscape. And in Hawaii, we are extremely exposed to that because we are a service-based economy that's seeing these things happen firsthand even today. And so for us, pile on top of that cost of living and all these other issues, and whether you're a business owner, an employee, or a retiree, you feel the stress constantly. And for most of my friends who are doctors and attorneys, a lot of us, just because of the cost of living, live with parents or live with aunties and uncles and friends and have to really sacrifice to make ends meet. So we've brought this group together to talk not only about the long term and how we get to this place, hopefully in the future, where families can make ends meet, but rather, what are the short-term steps as well? And we really set it up this way so that it is simultaneously long-term and short-term, because there are a lot of solutions like we've heard talked about here, whether it's expanding an EITC or providing portable benefits for folks to move from job to job with the security of healthcare and other basic needs met, or to go on to other things. We're open. I think people want to have a discussion and are willing to sit at the table because, frankly, our economy is changing in ways we've never seen it change before. And it's up to us as elected leaders, I feel, an obligation to put everything on the table and have that discussion with the public.
So you're saying that your task force is comprised of liberals, conservatives, business, labor, and yet you're able to actually focus them on a common threat, essentially, and therefore common interests, and you're hopeful that you can move some actual policy solutions forward?
Yeah, I think we've got a good track record of working together in perhaps much more politically cooperative environment than we're seeing in other places right now. So, I'm optimistic that we're going to see some movement, some meaningful movement in the next few years, not toward any one specific thing, but actually in improving the lives and the end result of being able to provide for people.
And so, Joe, as you've really promoted this very significant expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit here in California, what kind of politics are you running into?
Well, California is an interesting place where, to a lot of people outside of California, it's perceived as very progressive. But the reality is California's economy is deeply regressive. That for the 3 of 4 Californians who are a $700 surprise expense away from crisis, this is not a progressive island. That our progressivism exists on Twitter and CNN instead of in the real lives of working Californians. And the reason for that is we have many decades of progressive social policies and very corporate-oriented economic policies. And I think where the most resistance exists on creating a California where everyone who works can afford life's basic needs is in addressing the reason that we have a president where most people who are working can't afford their basic needs. I think there's an allergy to a deeper conversation about why do we need a lot more EITC? And the reason...
But not for the people you've mobilized. It's really for the decision makers and people who hold power who have this disconnect. That's sort of what you're saying?
No, I think also, well, among the people that we've mobilized, there's also a craving for a deeper discussion and change to get at the reasons why EITC is even necessary. The folks in Beverly Hills and Pacific Heights, I think, underappreciate the sophistication and collective wisdom of the many. And most people who are struggling understand that they're struggling because the economy is rigged. That there's an economy for monopolies with lobbyists, and there's an economy for the rest of us. And because we have these two economies, most of the rest of us are left barely able, if at all, to afford life's basic needs. And so one of the biggest pushbacks I hear, not about EITC, but when we're in communities is, thank you for more EITC, but can you actually fix the reason that EITC is so necessary? That conversation is one that I think a lot of elected officials are scared of having, but is ultimately one that we're going to push, because we can't create a future where everyone who works can afford life's basic needs through EITC alone. We actually have to get to the core reasons that the economy is so broken. And in closing, I'd like to borrow some words from a great intellectual named Matthew Stoller. And Stoller puts it like this, and I think it really captures the problem, which is politics has been stuck for a long time in this debate about how much of the loot we make the robbers give back. Progressives say we should make the robbers give a lot of the loot back. Conservatives say less. But it's on our generation now to finally stop the robbers from looting us in the first place.
I could not agree more with you and with Matt that the question about how to actually fix the economy so that it is more equal in the first place, or generating better security for more citizens in the first place. I do think that's where we need to go, and I think it's an interesting, not tension necessarily, but it's an interesting dynamic between things like the Earned Income Tax Credit that are going to fix immediate problems, and then asking ourselves how we're going to make the economy work better and get the flywheel turning in a much healthier direction. So that's a very important conversation.
But Can I add one little concert to that?
Sure.
The path to fixing the rigged economy is equipping low and middle income people themselves to be their best lobbyists. If our politicians hear from a flood of working people who are demanding a fix of this rigged economy, then we're going to finally see motion. And that's why the organizing we've done around Cali EITC for me is an important blueprint. Our policy wins in California are not because of any influencer. The policy wins in California are because of all the low and middle income people who've advocated with their legislators for policy expansion.
Well, I want to turn to the framing question in just a minute, but since you've kind of put politicians squarely in the middle of the target, and you've got two politicians on the stage with you here, maybe I'd actually, politicians, of course, on the right side of history, no doubt. But you know, Bill and Chris, I'm interested when many policy solutions that we see now, even big, bold, important policy solutions, maybe kind of after the fact, as opposed to helping to drive to actually fix the way the economy is working. How do you both see that conversation playing out in your professional lives, in your legislatures? Bill. I was a high school teacher, so I'm going to call on you. Bill.
So you raised actually a really interesting point. When the last couple of years, the legislature and the governor in Alaska were talking about cutting our permanent fund dividend checks. And I was running for election last year, and I went door to door. And I was amazed at how many people had no idea this was even happening. And then it happened, and people were shocked. And I think mobilizing the people to get out is really critical. It's a harder task for us. I think in a state like Alaska, we're so spread out. But I think that's really critical to this. You know, in a democracy, our democracy has become so inundated with special interest money, and the rich and the powerful able to manipulate things in their benefit, and that's just got to change.
And Chris, how do you see this playing out? Especially, I'm going to keep coming back to the kind of political spectrum that you have on your task force, just because I find it so remarkable. Maybe I shouldn't, but it's rare in my life that I see a group of people who span the political spectrum who are able to sit around the same table and talk about solutions. So when you think about this question of driving for solutions that will, as Joe put it, kind of solve for the rigged economy or actually make the economy work better, break monopoly power, et cetera, like how do you see that working in the conversations that you have with your colleagues?
It may not happen today, but I think people will see this eventually as inevitable. Because I think ultimately, whether it's a basic income or some form of cash that we're talking about in some mechanism, I think it is ultimately the evolution of capitalism as we know it to a better place, to provide not only for those who need it, but also to empower those who want it, to provide fairly and freely for everyone the kind of support they need to move forward and do more with their lives, to do what they want, to pursue their passions, and to do so with comfort that the bottom's not going to drop out and they're not going to be bankrupt tomorrow. This is really what drives innovation. We've had a country that's been built on risk-taking over the years, whether it's in business or any other area. I think we can improve that. We can accelerate the advancement in our society. We can provide for more people, and we can do it in a way that makes sense and pencils out. Clearly, the government structures and tax systems and rest of that regime as we know it today is no longer going to function as well in a world where we have an automated economy, where wealth has been swiftly transferred from a larger group to a smaller, and it is inevitable that we have to take some of these steps and have to start talking about them today. And I think when it comes to our colleagues, and I mean not just in Hawaii, but I mean throughout the country, I think it is inevitable that that public pressure, I think, will be brought to bear to have this discussion in a meaningful way. It may not be about any one particular mechanism, it may not be about any one solution, but it is definitely about the same problem. and it's about seeking solutions that work for each state or each jurisdiction, or hopefully the country as a whole. I think that is something that, whether it's this year or the next, or maybe 5 years from now, the time is right. Mm-hmm. And I think it's this group of people who are interested. It is the folks that engage because they're frustrated, because they can't make ends meet, no matter how hard they try, no matter how hard they work. And it's those especially who feel like their voice is lost to politicians and to a government that doesn't focus on them. I think that's who's going to change it. I think it's starting now.
Well, part of what that then brings us to, we talk about, having this be not just an expert conversation, but really, and not just an influencer's conversation, but really a conversation that all Americans are having, that gets to the question of like what we're talking about anyway and how we talk about it. And that goes back to the framing issue that, Bill, you had raised. And in this conversation, I've heard 3 or 4 different ways to talk about the challenge, right? One of them is the sort of family on the edge, $700 away from, economic crisis in your family. One is the larger question of sort of the economy's not working, the macro economy is not healthy. And then, of course, we hear both the Alaska point that actually we do have enough wealth because it is commonwealth. And then a lot of what we started today with was a conversation about technological change, concerns about automation, machine learning, AI, et cetera. So this is a really broad range of ways to frame up the need for basic income and or cash. I'm really interested in your perspectives on what you think is the most, well, 2 things. One, what's the most effective way to talk about it? And then secondly, what's the most true way or accurate way? Like what motivates you? You wake up because you're afraid of the robots, or you wake up because you're afraid that, most Americans, can't make ends meet? So what's the most accurate, but then what's the most politically effective? And Bill, I'll just go ahead and start with you again.
So in Alaska, we don't, as I mentioned, we don't talk about this as a basic income. This is our ownership share in our resource. And that really resonates with people on all sides of the political spectrum. The most ardent supporters of the Permanent Fund in Alaska are the most conservative. You look at the conservative bastions, areas that we have in Alaska, they are very, very passionate about this. And they look at it like, well, we all own the resource. This is us getting a dividend.
And do they feel that they own the resource and Indigenous Alaskans own the resource and new immigrants own the resource? Who's the we in that conversation?
That's a good question. Our Constitution says that the resources must be used for the maximum benefit of the people. So it is derived partially from our Constitution. There is some tension that arises. There's no doubt about it. There are certainly some people on the political spectrum who will say certain people shouldn't get the dividend. There are people who say people that just come to Alaska shouldn't get it. Immigrants shouldn't get it. We definitely have those battles, but I think as long as everyone is getting it, it makes it much more politically
So the
palatable.
universality.
Universality is critical, I think. If you started taking it away, making it needs-based, I think that would diminish it. Mm-hmm. I think there's other ways that you might want to take it back if you decide you need to raise revenue, but I think the universality, at least in Alaska, is really critical.
Right. And then, so Chris, I've heard you frame it at least 2 ways. As a matter of economic health and as a concern about automation within, especially in a service-based economy. So what do you find is the most effective way to talk about this?
Well, I don't think we should be afraid of robots. I mean, in an ideal world, Skynet maybe, but I think we're at a point where we should be embracing innovation. So I think we ought to keep that in mind, but more so than also a means to look at helping those who need help. This is really, I think, something that needs to be viewed as a potential universal benefit across all economic classes. To be able to have the ability to invest in a new business, be entrepreneurial, be able to take a break to go back and become educated and pursue some new degree. I mean, all these things are possible, to say nothing of the other benefits that we've talked about. I think that's something that can't be lost. So when thinking about this, I think it's important to recognize that there's going to be different mechanisms in different places that make the most sense. So rather than talk about specific mechanisms, I think we should lead with values. What's important to people? What's important to this country? What does it mean to pursue the American dream? And what does that mean in today's 21st century context? I think if we follow through with our own desires as members of a society, saying, yeah, all people should have basic financial security, or all people should have access to opportunity or financial freedom to pursue their dreams and passions, to be a productive member of the economy, I think that's something that everybody can get behind. And I think it's why, especially this issue now, even basic income as a mechanism has not been pigeonholed as either a Democratic or Republican, conservative or liberal issue. And I think if we keep our eye on the grand vision and the values that underlie it, I don't think we'll lose that.
Great. So Joe, how do you talk about it?
That we have to create a future where everyone who works can afford life's basic needs. And that mission statement is supported by 3 major policy pillars. 1, we have to make work pay. 2, we have to make life's basic needs affordable. And 3, we have to create an economy where everyone's playing by the same rules. I continue by making clear the point that the future is not going to be the result of these forces that are outside of our control. And nor is the present the result of an accident or forces that were not of our doing. We have a present where most people who are working can't afford life's basic needs because of bad policy choices over a very long period of time that have created a tax code that privileges wealth instead of rewarding work, that makes life's basic needs inaccessible to most people, and that creates different rules for monopolies with lobbyists than all the rest of us. And I think a challenge I would pose to Silicon Valley and right here being in the heart of quote unquote innovation is the future isn't going to be determined by Silicon Valley. The future is going to be determined by the democratic choices that we all collectively make about the kind of future that we want. If we want a future where everyone who works can afford life's basic needs, there are clear policies that we can create to enable that future. And it's something that all of us need to take right at Silicon Valley with a constructive challenge. Technology works for human beings, not the other way around. And we as citizens are going to create the future. We're not going to accommodate the future that a small number of technologists are going to create for us.
Well, I'm actually tempted to close on that, but I'm not going to because the clock says I have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to ask each of you kind of lightning round to give me an answer on a final question, which is, you each work in specific state contexts. What is your kind of under-over or your prediction on when this very big, bold set of ideas is going to become prominent on the national stage? And we'll just go this way. Chris, are we going to see this in national politics soon?
I think we're not going to get through another presidential election without this discussion being front and center.
I agree. It's happening now.
Agreed.
All right. Well, there you have it. Thank you.
Thanks.